Uruguay to Peru, Haiti to Guadeloupe, Colombia, and Venezuela, the music they developed shared a number of traits that originated in the African coastal and forest areas. Elaborate polyrhythm, percussion on African drums as opposed to European drums, collective participation, and call and response. Notably, these elements were conspicuously absent from the traditional music created by Africans and their descendants in the United States. In their music, drumming was non existent, while string instruments, banjo, fiddle, and later guitar, were the preferred medium. This African American specificity is very much in evidence in the blues. Analyzing the differences between African American music and that of the rest of the Western Hemisphere, Paul Oliver, in his slim but seminal 1970s volume Savannah Syncopators, African Retentions in the Blues, was the first to point out that the roots of the blues were not to be found in the coastal and forest regions of Africa. Rather, he stated, the blues was rooted in what he termed the Savannah hinterland, from Senegambia through Mali, Burkina Faso, northern Ghana, Niger, and northern Nigeria. Though research and debate will doubtless continue, experts agree that the roots of African American music are to be found in Islamic West Africa. Over the past 30 years, other musicologists and music historians have agreed with Oliver, but have offered divergent views on which area was the most dominant. Robert Palmer and Samuel Charters pinpointed Senegambia, while Alan Lomax, when not referring to West Africa in general, in the land where the blues began, specifically mentioned Senegal. Gerard Kubik, author of Africa in the Blues, was emphatic that West Central Sudan, from Mali to northern Ghana and Nigeria, northern and central Cameroon was the core, while Senegambia only showed some blues traits. Though research and debate will doubtless continue and be largely influenced by the specific area where someone did field work, these experts agree that the roots of African American music are to be found in Islamic West Africa. Since Muslim Africans were present throughout the Americas, what can explain the development and predominance of their musical style in the United States and not elsewhere? The ban on drumming. The first determinative episode in the history of African American music can be found in a significant 18th century incident. On September 9th, 1739, enslaved people from the Kingdom of Congo, which covered parts of today's Congo and Angola, staged an uprising in Stono, South Carolina. Their goal was to reach St. Augustine in Spanish Florida, where the authorities granted guaranteed freedom to any runaway. They marched with colors displayed and two drums beating. As their numbers grew, they set to dancing, singing, and beating drums to draw more Negroes to them. In the end, the uprising killed 20 whites and 40 Africans. The following year, South Carolina passed a law that stipulated it is absolutely necessary to the safety of this province that all due care be taken to restrain the wanderings and meetings of Negroes and other slaves at all times, and more especially on Saturday nights, Sundays, and other holidays, and their using and carrying wooden swords and other mischievous and dangerous weapons, or using or keeping of drums, horns, or other loud instruments which may call together or give sign or notice to one another of their wicked designs or purposes. It is significant that drums and horns were deemed as dangerous as weapons. The prohibition remained in place until the abolition of slavery. Georgia followed South Carolina's lead in 1740 and restated the ban in 1845. By law or by custom, drums were prescribed all over the South, except in Louisiana, which was French until 1803, where drumming was documented until the mid 1800s. Interestingly, the largest slave uprising in the United States took place in 1811 in southern Louisiana, where, in a scene reminiscent of Stono, a crowd of men and women marched along the river towards the city, divided into companies, each under an officer, with beat of drums and flags displayed. Interesting, they mentioned flags and drums. Okay, so anyways, so Akon, as we know, is from Senegal. And again, the notion that African Americans do not perform as well as Africans when African Americans are just carrying on with some modification African traditions does not make sense. Although drums and horns have been outlawed in the British Caribbean since the late 1600s for the same reason as in North America, enforcement was lax. And as music historian Edna Epstein summarized, slaveholders became convinced of the wisdom of permitting their slaves to dance and drum under normal conditions. White witnesses' description of public dances to the beat of drums were abundant throughout the Caribbean and South American colonies, but not in the United States. Moreover, drums were absent from the memories of formerly enslaved people in the United States. In the 1930s, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, interviewed about 2,300 men and women about their lives in slavery. 4 dozen made references to drums, but these were the Union Army's drums, or belonged to the African American fife and drum bands that accompanied the Union regiments. 2 references to drums used by enslaved people of interest. James Bolton of Georgia remarked, at a supper, we used to get around and knock tin buckets and pans. We beat them like drums. Some use their fingers and some use sticks for to make the drum sounds. Also in Georgia, Mac Mullen stated that in the evening, people on the plantation where he lived danced to the tune of a fiddle and a drum. In the remote areas and islands of Georgia, 138 formerly enslaved men and women were interviewed by the 1940 WPA. Uh, Formerly enslaved men and women were interviewed for the 1940 WPA study, Drums and Shadows, Survival Studies Among the Georgia Coastal Negroes. Despite the book's title, few informers mentioned drums. 2 people recalled Africans having drums, and about a dozen stated that drumming was done on the sea islands to announce somebody's death and during a funeral. The dearth of references to drums is equally striking in the numerous slave narratives, autobiographies of former slaves, and contrasts the significance of the drum in the lives of some Africans and its effective prohibition after they arrived in the United States are encapsulated in an episode that happened in 1865 In Mobile, Alabama. 5 years earlier, on July 8, 1860, 110 young people from Benin and Nigeria, many of them Yoruba, landed in Mobile. They were the last Africans brought illegally through the international slave trade. In April 1865, when Mobile fell to the Union Army, they were told they were free. Their first act was to make a drum. Coming from drum cultures, they viewed the heretofore forbidden instrument as an essential part of their lives and a symbol of their freedom. While the drum disappeared, its spirit did not. People created an original drumming ersatz. For polyrhythmic drumming, they substituted hand clapping, foot stomping, the beating together of bones or sticks, and patting juba. In 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup, born free but kidnapped and enslaved in Louisiana, described this genre practiced all over the South. Patting is performed by striking the hands on the knees, then striking the hands together, then striking the right shoulder with one hand, the left with the other, all the while keeping time with the feet and singing. As ingenious as they were, patting, juba, and bones and sticks could never replace the coastal and forest drummers, very complex and elaborate rhythms. As musician and critic Robert Palmer has underlined, the range of musical expression that was left to Africans from south to Senegal was cruelly circumscribed. String instruments, whereas their counterparts from the coastal and forest areas were no longer authorized to perform, enslaved Sahelian musicians who traditionally used string instruments could continue to do so. And as their style became prominent, it was picked up by native born musicians. One of the string instruments that gained prominence and was referenced more than 90 and excuse me, one of the string instruments that gained prominence and was referenced more than 90 times in former slaves' interviews was the banjo, whose African origin was common knowledge throughout the Americas. Thomas Jefferson observed in 1782, the instrument proper to them is the banja, which they brought hither from Africa, and which is the original of the guitar, its chords being precisely the four chords of the guitar. But long before Jefferson's remarks, the banjo was called a banjar, banza, banjer, banjo, banjoon, or bongo, also called a banjar, banza, banjer, bangil, banjoon, or bongo, was described in the Gambia in 1621 and appeared in numerous accounts from the French and British Caribbean as early as 1654. Made of a gourd or calabash, banjos in the Americas, like the various African lutes, had a round neck as opposed to the flat one that later became the norm. Laurent Dubois, in the Banjo, America's African Instrument, labels the banjo the first truly African instrument because in the Americas it connected the different musical traditions from West and West Central Africa. In 1819, Benjamin Latrobe described and sketched a banjo as well as drums that he saw at a gathering in New Orleans, Congo Square. So Congo Square is where the people say that jazz music originated. The most curious instrument was, however, The most curious instrument, however, was a string instrument which no doubt was imported from Africa. On the top of the fingerboard was the rude figure of a man in a sitting posture, and two pegs behind him to which the strings were fastened. The body was a calabash. It was played upon by a very little old man, apparently 80 or 90 years old. The early African's instrument did not resemble the Sahelian lutes in one important aspect, the figure of the man, noting the presence of anthropomorphic engravings or sculpture on some African string instruments, Dubois remarked. This tradition of decoration, interestingly, seems to have been less common in the string lutes from West Africa, whose construction more closely resembles that of the New World banjo. For religious reasons, African Muslims do not add anthropomorphic decorations to their instruments. This particularity may hint at a Sahelian rather than a coastal and forest origin for the American banjo. Besides the banjo, musicians were familiar